In this excerpt from Magic Markets, Justin Ritchie and Ryann Dean from Aylett & Co. share their views on the likely drivers of the downturn in alcohol volumes, and especially why they believe this creates opportunities. Listen to the full podcast for all the details, and always do your own research. I hope you enjoy this discussion. We begin with Ryann Dean giving us an overview of why surveys on alcohol consumption can be a dangerous data point to rely on.
Surveys what people self-report. There are going to be issues with that. So the Cornell University study, why that was very useful is that analyzed credit card spend, pre and post people using these drugs. So basically how much their spending patterns changed in the store, which is actual transactional data. There's no ifs, whens, and buts about that. That's the actual data they use. And what we found interesting is people spent less overall, and they spend less on things like sugary snacks, sweets, that kind of stuff. But then for alcohol, the net decrease was pretty small.
1.4% within the margin of error. So statistically, it actually doesn't tell you anything. It seems like when people are on GLP-1s, they eat less and drink less maybe, but they drink better. So that would explain why spend is unchanged. In terms of GLP-1s, structural change, no doubt that there is an effect. We think it looks quite small. And certainly when we do the numbers, the number of people on GLP-1s are not big enough, not statistically significant enough to account for the volume drop.
And I think a key point to add as well is that GLP-1s are still largely developed market impact and primarily really a US market impact right now. It's less widespread in the rest of the world.
Looks like small impact. So then the next candidate would be, Mo, as you mentioned there, generational drinking pattern change. This is a really interesting topic because I think there have been a lot of headlines, popular topic at the moment, also it was a year ago or so. When you look at the data, we agree with that. It's actually very clear in the data that the current generation will drink less than their parents. But what's interesting is that this is not new. This is something that's been happening for decades. What is interesting is that the slow drift is not nearly enough to explain the volume declines.
I went and looked at the French per capita alcohol consumption as a developed market that, as most of us know, is quite fond of wine, historically has been very fond of wine. Their alcohol consumption peaked per capita 1960-ish at 26 liters. We're down to under 10 now. That's pure alcohol across wine, spirits, and beer. Pretty much every single developed market you look at has seen lower per capita consumption for decades now.
And all through that period, what's interesting is these companies have been able to build big, profitable businesses with growing revenue. So selling less alcohol, but selling more premium alcohol. Generally, I mean, it's a little bit different in emerging markets for beer. Generational drinking pattern changes certainly are causing a decline in volumes, but it looks to be small. And then there was another very interesting survey that we came across, IWSR survey, and with a caveat that this is an alcohol industry run survey, but we've been through the methodology and it looks pretty sound. And what was really interesting, they asked people in 15 different countries about their alcohol consumption patterns over the last 6 months and how many people drank alcohol. And we've seen a very big shift in the last 2 years. I think overall there's about a 10 percentage points increase over the last 2 years in people participating in alcohol in the last 6 months.
From about 2/3 to about mid-70s.
So we're seeing the younger cohorts start to come back into the category. This is maybe anecdotal, but makes a lot of sense. And when you speak to the management teams of the alcohol companies, they will tell you that their data shows that there's a whole generation of young people late to leave home or stuck at home because of COVID. When you're stuck at home, I don't know about you, but I certainly wasn't having lots of mates over and drinking a lot of beer. I did that more when I had my own place. So that would explain some of the change. In terms of the structural candidates, we think that those two obviously are having some effect, but cannot explain the volume declines we've seen, the sharp declines we've seen in the last 3 years. So that kind of brings us to cyclical. If it is cyclical, that's a very interesting thing because cycles pass and they give us opportunities in markets and in stocks. And when we look at the cyclical candidates, I think there are really two. The first is inventory. So as we mentioned, there's a very long inventory cycle on spirits. That whiskey you've got sitting on your counter at home that you ordered in COVID is still good. But I don't know about you, but I don't have any beer that I ordered 4 years ago. It has a limited shelf life.
I certainly don't.
So there's this long inventory cycle. These things last a long time. There was this pull forward in demand. And we also think, and this was something that came across time and time again last week, is that there's an affordability problem in the alcohol category. People can't afford to spend what they used to. If you remember, the developed world had very low inflation for a good decade or so going into COVID. And then out of COVID, we've seen much higher inflation rates. sometimes hard for South Africans to understand because we've lived with inflation for many years. But if you go and look at menu prices in the UK or in Europe, often menu prices wouldn't change for years on end. And then we've seen 3 or 4 years where they've had to change quite regularly. And that shock has been felt by consumer wallets. So it looks like people are going back out. Restaurant traffic in many parts of the world is positive. But as the Campari CEO said to me last week, people are buying 2 drinks, not 3. And that has a big effect on their business. When we look at all the possible candidates, we think it's more cyclical than structural, which provides a pretty interesting jumping off point when you're analyzing potential companies to invest in, because the market is valuing them like this decline is terminal and not like it's cyclical.